afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to our Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence Distinguished Lecture for the fall semester, which is part of Pitt's International Week. Today's lecture is also the kickoff event for our Year of Recovering Europe programming. Today's lecture is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and co-sponsored by the Jean Monnet in the USA Network, which is a network of EU-funded centers and programs in the US. After the talk, we will have time for brief comments from Dr. Felix Germain. Following that, there will be time for Q&A. Students may raise their hand and ask their question directly of Professor Younge with their video and audio turned on, or you can ask your questions in the Q&A feature and I will read them. Non-students, please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm very pleased to virtually welcome to Pitt Gary Younge. He is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester in the UK. Formerly a columnist and US correspondent at The Guardian, he is on the editorial board of The Nation magazine and an Alfred Nobler Fellow for Type Media. He has written 5 books, most recently Another Day in the Death of America, which won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize from the Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation. In 2018, he was awarded the Feature Writer of the Year from the Society of Editors Press and Feature of the Year from Amnesty International for a series on knife crime. In 2015, Harvard Shorenstein Center awarded him the David Nyhan Prize for Political Journalism. He has also written for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the London Review of Books, Granada, and GQ. He's an honorary fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of both the Academy of Social Sciences and the Royal Society of Literature in Britain. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, JJ, and thanks so much for having me. We had hoped that we might be able to do this in person, but events regarding the pandemic would not allow, and so here I am again in my daughter's bedroom, surrounded by pink unicorns and yes, in a domestic and non-domestic state. But thank you for having me all the same, albeit virtually. I want to start with a story from the summer of 1944, when the Allies were preparing for the Paris liberation, and General de Gaulle planned to walk in triumph down the Champs-Élysées as the returning conqueror. But there were a few problems. First, it was primarily the Americans and then the British who had liberated France, not him. But second, there was the question of optics. 2/3 of the Free French forces, which he commanded, comprised colonial troops, overwhelmingly from Africa and the Caribbean. And if this were truly going to be a victory for civilization over barbarism, then for the Western Allies at least, the visuals were all wrong. America still exercised strict segregation over its military personnel. Britain still had the rigid caste system of empire to protect. The sight of black troops liberating a European nation, even symbolically, was more than the Americans could bear. In a memo stamped confidential, referring to the troops that might accompany de Gaulle on his victory lap, Dwight Eisenhower's chief of staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, wrote, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel." The British agreed. Even with these manipulations, it was not possible to find an all-white division or enough white people. So the Allied command insisted that all the black soldiers be taken out and replaced by white ones from other units. And when even that didn't suffice, soldiers from parts of North Africa and the Middle East, who were deemed at least light enough, were also included. But when the day finally came, at least one guy didn't get the memo. George Duxon from Gabon was 22. His dad had fought for the French in the First World War, and he'd signed up for the Second. He was caught by the Germans, put in a prisoner of war camp in 1940, but escaped in 43, joined the resistance, and made his way to Paris. In the week preceding the German surrender, he fought tenaciously in street-to-street combat, earning himself the nickname the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. In the run-up to de Gaulle's victory parade, he bet his friends that he could not just join the parade, but get in the newspapers. And so there he is. Photobombing de Gaulle as he walks down the Champs-Élysées. Appearing just in shot and sometimes over the general's shoulder, as the French leader's bodyguards desperately tried to shove him out of the camera's eye and beyond history's gaze. There you see him. The particular way in which Europe views Black America is shaped by three principal factors that are all laid bare in Duxton's story. First, what do Europeans think about America and how do they react to its dominance? Second, what do Europeans think about their own place in the world and how do they react to their decline? And finally, what does Europe think about Black people, both in Europe and elsewhere? I concede from the outset the porous nature of these categories. Europe is a big place, Black is a big thing. Europe's are a varied people with varied histories and a range of opinions on a range of issues, not least race and geopolitics. And I have some experience of this range of racial positioning myself. My first degree was in French and Russian. An integral part of the course demanded that I spend 5 months in Paris and 5 months in what was then Leningrad and is now St. Petersburg. It was the academic year of 1990-91. My time in Paris was one of the most racially intense periods I have ever encountered. Among other things, I was denied entry to nightclubs, cabs refused to take me even when I queued for them at a rank, I was stopped and asked for my papers on an almost daily basis, and was beaten up by the police in the metro. My time in Leningrad could not have been more different. This is my period piece student card, complete with my student plats. The Eastern Bloc had imploded and the Soviet Union was in a state of severe economic distress, while the US was demonstrating its post-Cold War supremacy with its swift victory in the first Gulf War. The monthly wage of my landlady, who was raising her son by herself, was worth around $20. So the US was a place to aspire to, while the Soviet Empire felt like an embarrassing folly. In this context, African students became emblems of a failed past and subject to frequent physical assault. But somehow, with my locks, Adidas trainers, and huge loop earring, I was not identified with them, and so it was assumed that I was American and therefore wealthy. I had to vouch for my fellow students when we went to Western hotels. Cars would stop and turn into cabs at the sight of me in the hope that I would pay them in dollars. It was the only time in my life when anybody looked at me and thought I must be rich. I was the same person on the same continent during the same time period. It was the understanding of what my presence signified that changed. And yet, for all these differences, there are some general observations that rise above mere generalizations that I would like to examine. I want to start with a remark made by a former colleague at The Guardian, where I worked for 26 years, at one of our morning meetings. It was 1998, and we had finished discussion about the public inquiry into the racist murder of a Black teenager in Britain called Stephen Lawrence. And then we moved on to news of a gruesome racist murder in Jasper, Texas, where a 49-year-old African-American, James Byrd, had been tied to the back of a pickup truck by 3 white men and driven 3 miles along an asphalt road while he was still alive. By the time they were finished, his head and right arm had been severed from his body, which was dumped in front of a Black church. On hearing the details, my colleague turned to me and said, "Well, at least we don't do that here." I responded, "Well, I'm not sure that will be much comfort to Stephen Lawrence's parents." But herein lies one of the central elements of European attitudes when it comes to the status of Black Americans, a sense of moral superiority that is informed, or rather ill-informed, by a confluence of amnesia about Europe's own colonial past and ambivalence about its racial present, which sit alongside a genuine tradition of anti-racism and international solidarity, all enveloped in an often fraught geopolitical relationship with the US itself. Now, comparisons can, of course, be made between the lived experiences of Black people in one place and another. Indeed, Black people make them all the time. Take Germany. In his autobiography, Black German, Theodor Michael, who was born in Germany in 1925 to a Cameroonian father and German mother, expressed his intention to emigrate to the US after the war. But then he experienced Jim Crow close up and personal when American military police forced him to leave a function where he was dancing with his white German partner, Friedel. It wasn't so hard for me to give up my hopes of a future in the USA, he wrote. Once I had learned something about the way Black people were treated there, and I certainly couldn't picture a so-called mixed race couple like us coping with the problems that we would face in the USA of the 1940s. Then again, a 1946 edition of the African-American magazine Ebony remarked, strangely enough, here where Aryanism ruled supreme, talking of Germany, Negroes are finding more friendship, more respect, and more equality than they would back home either in Dixie or on Broadway. Many of the Negro GIs in the German capital are from the South and find that democracy has more meaning on Wilhelmstrasse than on Beale Street in Memphis. In France, the African-American novelist Richard Wright wrote of his 1946 arrival, "In Paris, there is such an absence of race hate. For the first time in my life, I stepped on free land. If you're not Black, you will never know how heavy weights seem to fall off your body. There was more freedom in one square block of Paris than there was in the entire United States." People will make a range of choices about their life chances and migration that demand comparison. That, by definition, is agency. But there is an important distinction to be made between Black people deciding where they would like to live and white people, like my former colleague, opining on which form of racism is preferable. The latter presupposes the inevitability of racism and Black people's need to be grateful for its more benevolent manifestations. It does not pretend to aspire to a world without racism, but a life where racism is tolerable. To grasp the limitations of this strand of thought, one need only reflect that over the 12 years that I was a correspondent for the Guardian newspaper in America, I never heard a white Briton being asked, which is the best country to be white in? The question wouldn't make sense. When I was returning to Britain from America in 2015, a year after the response to the killing of Michael Brown's made Black Lives Matter a household name, many people asked if the reason I was leaving America was because of racism. Yes, I told them sarcastically. I'm returning to Hackney in London to escape racism. So where did this sense of moral superiority among Europeans with regard to the treatment of Black Americans come from? Well, it partly stems from the fact that over the roughly 3 generations before the end of World War II, Europe had lost its sense of superiority in so many other spheres. Economically, military, geopolitically, this was America's century, and Europe felt that keenly. America's involvement in the war had been crucial, and it had emerged relatively unscathed. Western Europe could not be rebuilt without American assistance, and many resented it, not least because that assistance came with conditions. It was, after all, the Americans who had insisted on the optics for de Gaulle's white-only parade down the Champs-Élysées. The French, who delivered more votes to the Communist Party in 1946 than any other, poured scorn on the colonization of what they saw as cultural imperialism within the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union, of course, had its own ideological reasons and amplified them through its new satellites on the continent. But this wasn't just an issue of America's ascent on the global stage, but Europe's descent. On May the 8th, 1945, the day the war in Europe officially ended, celebrations in French-occupied Algeria were interrupted when some Algerians were seen waving independence flags and shouting anti-colonial slogans at the victory parade. When the police confronted them, a riot ensued. Over the next few days, Algerian nationalists went on a rampage, killing between 80 and 100 European settlers. The settlers responded with a massacre that left between 15,000 and 45,000 Algerians dead. And so it was that the continent entered peacetime with decades of unrest to come. Within a year, there had been general strikes in Syria and Senegal, both controlled by the French. Ho Chi Minh had declared independence for Vietnam from France, and Indonesia declared independence from the Netherlands. Within 5 years, India, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar had all declared independence from Britain. Madagascans were in revolt against the French, and the West Indians had come to England and beat them at cricket. This was only the beginning. Delusions that this former status could either be revived or even that its decline had never actually occurred remain. They informed much of the rhetoric around Brexit in Britain. The Danish finance minister, Christian Jensen, pointed out in 2013, there are two kinds of European nations. There are small nations, and there are nations that have not yet realized that they are small nations. And in the midst of this downward mobility, the desire to feel comparatively competent at something can feel urgent. America's hard power was undeniable, but its soft power was porous, and the blatant codified nature of its racism became a significant handicap. In the West, America cut a figure not unlike Ernest Harridan in A Picture of Dorian Gray, who, I quote, had no enemies, but was thoroughly disliked by his friends. Beyond the West, it simply looked like a hypocrite. This was painfully evident in the immediate post-war period. Coming back to the original tale of de Gaulle's parade, if the war had been for democracy, then nobody told Duxon or the soldiers who were sent home. In Germany, the same Americans who were charged with denazification were operating strict color bars for their segregated troops. During the height of the Cold War, when the US wasn't lecturing the Eastern Bloc on democracy, it was unleashing dogs, hoses, and billy clubs on Black people trying to vote at home. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, in the 60s said, the issue of race relations deeply affects the conduct of our foreign policy relations. I'm speaking of the problem of discrimination. Our voice is muted. Our friends are embarrassed. Our enemies are gleeful. We are running this race with one of our legs in a cast. Now, for the Eastern Bloc, the Black American condition provided clear evidence of the degenerate nature of American capitalism. Following the scenes of Black youth beaten and attacked in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, the newspaper of the Soviet Communist Party, Pravda, ran a front-page headline, "Monstrous Crimes Among Racists in the United States." There was irony, if not hypocrisy, in this too. The joy of living in a dictatorship is that what you did not want to see, what you don't want to see, you could always ban or ignore. At the East German Book Fair in Leipzig in 1947, a new version of the standard dictionary, Duden, appeared in which the term Rasse, or race, referred only to breeds of dogs. In 1950, Walter Ulbricht declared that, and I quote, there is no longer any racial hatred in the German Democratic Republic. It was banned. But saying it was so didn't make it so. Efforts at international solidarity, which included offering educational opportunities for the elites of newly independent post-colonial nations, exposed these contradictions. Few months after Pravda lambasted the US for its racism in Birmingham, Alabama, 500 to 700 African students gathered in Red Square for the first recorded demonstration there since the late 20s, protesting racism following the death of Ghanaian medical student Edmund Asare Ado. One carried a banner, "Moscow is a second Alabama." The Soviet authorities shrugged off the complaint. Apparently, the convenient riposte, "at least we don't do that here," was not the preserve of Western Europe. But while there was some schadenfreude in this for the East, in the West, it was regarded, America's racial situation was regarded as genuinely unfortunate. Their opposition to American hegemony was not for the most part ideological, but solipsistic and strategic. They lamented African Americans privately, discreetly, and unproductively. As such, Black America occupied a redemptive force within their imagination, even if it rarely made it into their foreign policy. The plight of Black Americans was living proof that America is both not all that it claims to be, and that it could be so much greater than it is. The 19th century French intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "No African came in freedom to the shores of the New World. The Negro transmits to his descendants at birth the external mark of his ignominy. The law can abolish servitude, but only God can obliterate its traces." The denial of full citizenship, first in law and then in fact, left Black Americans in the white European gaze as being from, but not entirely of, the US, central to a version of its culture, but absolved from consequences of its power. The Northern Irish Republican author and screenwriter Ronan Bennett, who was wrongfully imprisoned for terrorism by the British in the infamous Long Kesh in the early 70s, once told me, "From a very early age, my family supported Martin Luther King and civil rights. We had this instinctive sympathy with Black Americans. A lot of the iconography and even anthems like We Shall Overcome were taken from Black America." This sense of identification was most explicitly seen in France, starting, or most prominently, with Josephine Baker, the singer and dancer who renounced her American citizenship, became a French resistance agent, and received the esteemed Légion d'honneur in 1961. But in the post-war period, it extended to many writers, including Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Chester Himes. This redemptive status has been at some times an act of straightforward solidarity, and at others a matter of infantilization and exoticization, and often a mixture of both. From the pulpit of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls were killed in a racist bombing in 1963, stands the Wales window, a stained glass portrayal of a Black Christ gifted by the Welsh artist John Petts. Petts heard of the bombing on the radio and was so moved that, with the help of Wales' main newspaper, the Western Mail, he launched a public campaign to fund the replacement of the window that had been shattered by the bomb. In the Soviet Union, the fledgling Soviet Union, its most celebrated poet, one of its most celebrated poets, Vladimir Mayakovsky, wrote a poem in 1927 that went, "If I were an elderly Negro, I would learn Russian without being despondent or lazy just because Lenin spoke it." Lenin's favorite book as a child was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The exoticization of Josephine Baker in the Revue Nègre was no one-off, even if Baker herself was quite unique. In the late 60s, the West German media described the activist Angela Davis as the militant Madonna with an Afro look and the Black woman with the bush hairdo. In the East, they referred to her as the beautiful dark-skinned woman who captured the attention of Berliners with her wide, curly hairstyle in the Africa look. The Free Angela Davis campaign told the New York Times it received 100,000 letters of support from East Germany, too many to even open. This framing of Black America as essentially dissident struggled in the post-civil rights era as a significant number of Black Americans moved into the middle class and a handful arrived in positions of political power or the moneyed aristocracy. To the outside world, the principal voices articulated in the case for the Iraq War, for example, the last one, and the war on terror in general, were Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. Meanwhile, its sporting prowess expanded to golf, and its singers evoked not racial pride, but crude materialism. This in part explains the disconnect in Britain around Meghan Markle, who had other options. Unable to claim the privileges of her class in Britain, a title for her son, security for herself, she returned to the slightly more diverse aristocracy in America, trading Buckingham Palace for a wing in Tyler Perry's mansion. For all that, one shouldn't deny or diminish why so many African Americans have preferred Europe over the years. In the metropole itself, Europe had less hardened attitudes and codified norms to deal with racial difference, which made space for a range of life choices, particularly interracial relationships, as well as traditions with proven anti-racist and internationalist potential to exist if not flourish. Trade unions, socialist and communist parties, liberalism, Quakers, abolitionists, republicanism, and so on were less directly tested and therefore more flexible to the challenge of racism in Europe than in America, even if they didn't always meet that challenge. But the continent of Europe has three other talents which compromise its credibility in claiming any sense of superiority. The ability to practice racism abroad, the ability to affect and know nothing about the racism it practices abroad or practiced abroad, and then to forget what it was supposed to be ignorant about. So first, just as Europe has proved adept at exporting anti-racism, it has a history of exporting racism too. De Tocqueville was right to point out that no African came in freedom to the shores of the New World, but he neglected to make it clear that it was primarily the Old World that brought them there. Europe has every bit as vile a history of racism as the Americas. Indeed, the histories are entwined. One of the central differences between Europe and the US in this regard is that Europe practiced its most egregious forms of anti-Black racism outside of Europe. Second, this reality could not be squared with their outrage at the treatment of African Americans. The kind of redemption they saw in Black America was not one they could countenance in those dark-skinned people over whom they ruled themselves. These contradictions often occurred simultaneously. 2 months after Baker received the Légion d'honneur, the Parisian police massacred several hundred Algerian protesters and arrested more than 10,000 following an independence march. Similarly, in between Pett's hearing of the Birmingham bombing and his stained glass window being installed in Alabama, 6 African countries liberated themselves from British rule, and more would come later. If Petts were in search of a heart-rending story thousands of miles from home in the previous years, he could have looked to Kenya, where his own government was torturing and murdering people in response to a revolt for full citizenship and democracy. In the third volume of her autobiography, Singing and Swinging and Getting Merry Like Christmas, Maya Angelou echoed Baldwin's skepticism about the universality of the French welcome. Reflecting on the frosty reception meted out to her Senegalese friend when he accompanied her to a party in 1954, she wrote, and I quote, "Paris was not the place for me or my son. The French could entertain the idea of me because they were not immersed in guilt about a mutual history. Just as white Americans found it easier to accept Africans, Cubans, or South American Blacks than the Blacks who had lived with them foot to neck for 200 years. I saw no benefit in exchanging one kind of prejudice for another." One of the central distinctions between the racial histories of Europe and the United States is that the European repression and resistance took place primarily abroad. The kernel of Europe's civil rights movement was in Guinea or Senegal, Zaire, Ghana, India, and so on. And in the post-colonial era, this has left significant room for denial, distortion, ignorance, and sophistry. And third, unable to make sense of this discrepancy, many Europeans decided to ignore it and pretend that it didn't exist. George Orwell in England, Your England wrote, "It's quite true that the English are hypocritical about their empire. In the working class, this hypocrisy takes the form of not knowing that the empire exists." In 1951, a UK government social survey revealed that 59% of people, 59%, could not name a single colony. The French philosopher Ernst Renan once wrote, "The essential characteristic of a nation is that its individuals must have many things in common and must have forgotten many things as well. The selective amnesia around the past leads ineluctably to a deeply flawed understanding of the present. European views on Black America are in no small part ill-informed because of the incomplete and toxically nostalgic misunderstanding of their own history. 1 in 2 of the Dutch 1 in 3 of Britons, 1 in 4 of the French and the Belgians, and 1 in 5 Italians believe their country's former empire is something to be proud of, according to a YouGov poll from March last year. Conversely, only 1 in 20 Dutch, 1 in 7 French, 1 in 5 Brits, and 1 in 4 Belgians and Italians think that their empire is something to be ashamed of. True, not every European nation had colonies. As such, this state of historical amnesia doesn't apply to the entire continent in a uniform way. Indeed, some European nations were at times themselves either colonized or occupied by others. To create a category like Europe is, by definition, to draw on certain commonalities and overlook certain specificities. It is, as I made clear at the beginning, porous. So this is not every nation's story. And yet, given the colonial entanglements of Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, it's fair to say that it's impossible to understand the continent without some reflection on colonialism. Moreover, the global economic system shaped by colonialism, the legacy of which endures, enveloped the whole of Europe in a certain project, which was underpinned by certain racial and racist values and assumptions which enjoyed free movement through the continent. But specifically with regard to those nations who made colonialism central to their sense of prestige and development, the indignation with regard to race in America all too often bears insufficient self-awareness to see what most of the rest of the world has seen. They wonder, in all sincerity, how America could have arrived at such a brutal place with either no recognition or no regrets that they have traveled that path themselves. The standard of racial conversation, even among those Americans who would consider themselves sympathetic, cultured, liberal, and informed, is woefully low. Black America has never fit easily within this complicated web of geopolitical insecurity and decline, moral assertion, and historical omission, particularly in the post-war period. Here, I want to spend a bit of time focusing on the experience of Black GIs, both during and after the war, for the simple reason that this was the moment at which there were most Black Americans on the continent and that most Europeans would have had a chance to actually interact with them. As such, it's crucial to recognize Black Americans first arrived in Europe during this period en masse, either as conquerors or liberators. An American corporal earned as much as a French general, better paid, fed, and armed than most locals, yet bearing that mark to which de Tocqueville referred, that suggested a story with less status and humanity. Some locals were hostile, but most had, in truth, thought precious little about African Americans at all. A British Ministry of Information survey conducted between January 42 and March 43 revealed that to the question, what do you least like about the USA, only 2% answered treatment of Negroes or attitude to race problems, and only 1% wanted to know more about racial matters. Britain was not particular in this regard. Before American soldiers arrived in Europe en masse during the Second World War, precious few Europeans had ever seen a Black person. This moment of engagement was brought beautifully to life in James McBride's novel Miracle at Santa Anna, where an African-American soldier, which is set in Italy, where an African-American soldier encounters a boy who's just gained consciousness. The boy looks at the soldier standing over him and says, the man was a huge chocolate giant, staring down at him from underneath a battered American helmet. His skin was as black as coal, his teeth were as white as diamonds. The boy had never seen anything like him. The boy had heard of men like this somewhere in the corners of his jagged glass-wind memory, but he could not recall. Where is your tail? He said in Italian. Now, this ignorance shifted the longer Black GIs were around. Take Germany. In GIs and Fräuleins, Maria Hearn writes that many Germans preferred the Black GIs to the white soldiers because Black GIs were more generous with their food rations and did not approach the defeated Germans with the sort of arrogance that many of the white soldiers displayed. In Trivialneger, Rosemary Lester points out that in many of the serialized post-war novels, Germans compare their own suffering to that of blacks in the US. In Race After Hitler, Heidi Fehrenbach writes, in a village near during their 6-month tour, nearly every German household had its own Hausneger or house negro to supply it with scarce food or goods, recalled one German woman. In Britain, an analogous story was told. The mass observation survey of June 43 revealed that while 10% of Britons had an anti-colour bias, that bias tended to decrease or even disappear with contact. In December 1943, Orwell commented, "The general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes." Once again, these affections were not uncomplicated. The UK's Ministry of Information report cited the most common attitude to black GIs was one of paternal tolerance, I quote, not unmixed with sympathy for the underdog. There was a tendency, they wrote, to regard the Negroes as childish, happy, and naive fellows who mean no harm. And then there are the possibly apocryphal words of one white West Country farmer in Britain who said, "I love the Americans, but I don't like these white ones they've brought with them." The borders to this sense of cordiality reached the bedroom, but went no further. American racism and European racism generally found each other in their revulsion towards a rejection of miscegenation. The dynamics of gender and class oppression conspired to brand any white woman who became involved with black GIs as a sex worker from the working class, the implication being that no respectable woman would engage in such a relationship, and no woman at all would do so without being paid. Politically, Black America's presence in Europe would soon be eclipsed by the arrival of Black people from the former colonies. Indeed, as Black Americans were shipping out, the colonial diaspora started shipping in, primarily to Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But these new arrivals were not the citizens of a more powerful nation sent to protect Europe with better pay, but rather often long-lost subjects of the empire, primarily from Africa and the Caribbean, or newly independent states of the developing world, flocking to the metropole to rebuild it on low pay. In time, it would become clear that, unlike African Americans, they had no intention of leaving. Europe, in short, would soon have a domestic race issue of its own that it could no longer ignore or dismiss because it was taking place abroad. Britain, where people came in large numbers earliest, provided an early warning as to what kind of reception they would get. The HMS Windrush landed in 1948, marking the symbolic commencement of post-war colonial migration, with several hundred former Jamaican servicemen on board. By 1951, Winston Churchill was suggesting to his cabinet that the Conservatives run their election campaign with the slogan, "Keep Britain White." In 1958, racist pogroms erupted in London and Nottingham. Throughout this time, Black America dominated Britain's racial consciousness, even as Black Britons forged their own particular racial reality. Prominent African American figures would make occasional cameos. Malcolm X filled the halls of the Salle de Mutualité in Paris and the Oxford Union in '64. A year later, he'd be refused entry into France shortly before his assassination. A year later, Baldwin came to Britain to debate race with Michael Buckley at the Cambridge Union. A couple of weeks after Malcolm X's death, he was asked by a reporter if the colour problem in Britain could produce a Malcolm X. He replied, "Britain is no longer white. Black people have been working for you for a long time. Now they come into your country and cities, and it is their country as well as yours. London is their metropolis as well as yours." The most consequential intervention by far of this nature was Audre Lorde, who is credited with coining the term Afro-German and galvanizing a cohort of young Black German women to start a movement and write a book, Farbe bekennen, or Showing Our Colors, which became a seminal text in the development and articulation of a Black German identity. Culturally and politically, the US has a heft unlike any other nation, and that influence extends to African Americans. For several decades, its theorists set our debates. Its films and books started our conversations. As late as the 80s, it was common for British newspapers to fly an American commentator over to Britain in moments of racial crisis, in belief that we had no commentators worthy of the task, or that their view would be too parochial. For decades, our Black History Month would feature Martin Luther King, but make no mention of Claudia Jones, the journalist and campaigner who started the Notting Hill Carnival. Well into my 30s, I was far more knowledgeable about the literature and history of Black America than Black Britain, where I was born and raised, or the Caribbean, where my parents are from. Black America has held a hegemonic role within the Black diaspora because, marginalized as it has been within America, it has a reach that no other Black minority can match. Across Europe, we know the names of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and George Floyd. But Jerry Maslow, who escaped apartheid South Africa only to be killed by racists near Naples in 1989, prompting the first major law legalizing the status of immigrants in Italy, is barely known beyond Italy, and maybe even in Italy at this point. Similarly, the story of Benjamin Hammonson, the 15-year-old Norwegian Ghanaian boy who was murdered by neo-Nazis in Oslo in 2001, sparked huge demonstrations and a national anti-racism prize, but is often not told beyond Norway. What was celebrated in Black America as dissidence was condemned in Europe as dysfunction. The charade of moral superiority was maintained only with the proviso that America's racism was somehow worse, more profound, and ultimately more authentic. But today, fascism is once again a mainstream ideology on the continent, with openly racist parties a central feature of the landscape, framing policy and debate when they are not in power. Just this week, Mussolini's granddaughter won the highest number of votes in an election to Rome City Council. Just last month, the far-right AfD won more than 10% in Germany. So when the video of George Floyd went viral last summer, our body politic could not claim to have the vaccine. Instead, a range of variants appeared as protests mounted across the continent, connecting the racism in America to the racism experienced in Europe. Of course, there was pushback. American racism is not the same, they claimed, which is true. Given the significant number of deaths in custody of Black and brown people across the continent, it was also not true enough. America is more lethal thanks to the prevalence of firearms, and it stands to reason that its racism would also be more lethal. But while they are not the same, they do translate. Levels of incarceration, unemployment, deprivation, poverty are all higher for Black Europeans. Racial disparities in COVID. In Britain, for example, are the precarity of Black life in late-stage capitalism is not unique to America, even if it is most regularly laid bare there. To that extent, Black Lives Matter exists as a floating signifier that could find a home last summer in most European cities and beyond. So while the seeds were sown in Minneapolis, they pollinated across the globe, including on this continent, and found their targets. Recent events in France offer a pertinent example of how persistent the amnesia, nostalgia, and unentitled sense of superiority can be. Paris hosted some of the largest BLM demonstrations on the continent. Like many public institutions across the continent, the Paris Opera conducted a diversity review in the wake of the uprisings. At the press conference, the artistic director, Alexander Neef, said as a result, some works would be removed from the repertoire and there would be no blackface or yellowface. But French Republican values don't recognize race as a valid category. They refuse to even count the number of Black citizens or recognize their difference in any official way. Rejecting multiculturalism in favor of universalism, the official line is, we're all French. All other differences are not only secondary but irrelevant and were still divisive. The trouble is, while they may refuse to recognize race, racism remains rampant and racialized politics is central to the culture. So even though the response of Paris Opera's artistic director was both measured and sane, it was still greeted with alarm. What to do but blame the whole thing on the New World? The Le Monde editor said that this was evidence of a creeping identity politics coming from the Atlantic. True, the director was German, but he had worked in Toronto and therefore, I quote, had soaked up American culture for 10 years, as though that's not identity politics. The threat was not homegrown, insisted French President Emmanuel Macron, but the product of certain social science theories entirely imported from the US. Next month, Josephine Baker will be reinterred in the Pantheon, only the fifth woman, third Black person, and first Black woman to be laid to rest there. A ceremonial moment for sure, but also characteristically a symbolic political intervention that can only be made by the president. The petition to have her placed there was started by writer Laurent Kupferman, who told the New York Times he thinks Macron approved the reinterment because Josephine Baker embodies the Republic of Possibilities. He continued, I quote, "How could a woman who came from a discriminated and very poor background achieve her destiny and become a world star? That was possible in France at a time that it was not in the United States." It's as though the question of why no French woman from a similar background in France could achieve their destiny at home had never occurred to him. In conclusion, Europe's capacity to misunderstand America is directly related to its propensity to misunderstand itself. Its ability to practice substantial anti-racist solidarity is real, but selective and undermined by solipsism and amnesia. Its ability to demonstrate compassion is genuine, but partial and hampered by callous hyperopia, the ability to see the things that are closest to you clearly. It contracts out its anti-racism in the vain hope that the voice of those who experience and witness its own inequalities firsthand will not be heard and the evidence of those inequities will not be seen. But the heirs of George Duxon have no more intention of disappearing quietly into the night than Duxon himself. And their presence and challenge is a starting place for Europe's reevaluation of its understanding of Black America. Shift your gaze and you will see them. Adapt your analysis and you will account for them. Wipe your lens and they will appear as clear as day. And whatever they may be, wherever they may be, insisting on their presence and forcing themselves into the frame, there will be someone in power trying to shove them from view and a liberal apologist in a distant land insisting, at least we don't do that here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was a very insightful talk, and I'm sure our audience has given our audience a lot to think about. I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Felix Germain, who is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He holds a PhD in African diaspora studies from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Germain's research focuses on Black migrations and race relations in France and the United States, as well as contemporary socio-political issues in Haiti and the French Caribbean. His publications include Decolonizing the Republic, African and Caribbean Migrants in Post-War Paris, 1946 to 1974, and with Céline Larcher, Black Women, French Women, and the Struggle for Equality, 1848 to 2016. While Felix is providing some comments, please take some time to think of your own questions, and we'll have time for Q&A after the comments. Felix?
Thank you, Gary, for this wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot, and it was really on point. And it's interesting that you mentioned Josephine Baker, because it's as if Josephine Baker sort of didn't have a political identity until she came to Europe, right? So she's on the Arc de Triomphe, but what about before? So it's during the interwar period, we have to think about how Europe imagined or perceived African Americans, right? And for them, they imagine African Americans as entertainers, exotic subjects without political identity, right? The idea that African Americans have been building political identities, have been political people since 1619, never really occurred to them. And so this is, as you suggest, this is Europe's first blatant misconception of Black America. By the mid-20th century, African Americans became entangled with Euro-American relations. And as you know, they were utilized as living proof that the United States is not what it claims to be, right? It's not this great, land of the free place, but also as a proof that America could still be much greater than it is. By the mid-20th century, it is also clear that for Europeans, the measuring bar for racism is American-style de jure segregation, right? That's the measuring bar for racism. And African Americans continuously appeared as victims of the US, confirming that countries like England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, treated people of color, usually they are former colonial subjects, better than America treated African Americans. It is also around the same period that Europe finally sort of acknowledges African American political identities, right? Around the same time. It's during the civil rights movement, African Americans are portrayed as marginalized citizens struggling to peacefully integrate the nation. They are integrationists. And for a nation like France, for instance, African-American integrationism vindicated what they've always been preaching to their colonial subjects, right? Which is, no, if you assimilate to French culture, if you assimilate to French culture and you respect those values, then that is your ticket to civilization. So France and other nations, but France praised the NAACP, the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Alliance. They praised their integrationist discourses because this political philosophy aligned with her universalist tradition. This is, if you read Le Monde of the late 50s and 60s and the French news and the other French newspapers, that's what you see. But if African-American organizations and individuals fighting for integration aligned with French post-colonial politics, those who oppose integration and promoted the development of self-sustaining African-American communities represented a threat to an active threat to the French government. And so we have to remember, so why do those who sort of sort of oppose integration and promote self-sustaining African communities, why do they represent a threat to the French government? Because we have to remember that in the late 40s, France integrates certain Caribbean islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and regions, French Guyana, also in the Pacific Réunion, in the Indian Ocean Réunion, I'm sorry. And so we have to remember that, and it's a complicated process. We also have to remember that, so talking about separatism is not what they really want to hear when they just integrated these islands, and there are some issues. And especially also after the Algerian War. That is not something that they want to hear. So what does it say? Why am I talking about this? I'm saying that the French case reveals that local situations also informed how Europeans perceive African Americans. Local situations inform that perception. And the best example that comes to my mind, and you mentioned this in your presentation, is the reception that England and France gave Malcolm X, right? After Malcolm X gave a speech to Paris, gave a speech in Paris to an audience largely comprised of French, Caribbean, and African students, he was not allowed to return to France. And that makes sense in the French context because he had called for African unity and he indirectly criticized French neo-colonial politics. Now, Malcolm X visited England 4 times, and there his schedule was quite full. So again, local situations inform how Europeans view African Americans and Black America. There is this sort of general image, but we also have to think about these local issues. The last point I want to make is really, I want to shift to how Black Europeans view African Americans and perhaps address issues of misconception. And I think, you know, there are 2 ways in which we can frame this discussion. One would be to talk about Afro-Europeans in relation to Black internationalism, right? So if we have this discussion, then we're going to think, if we take this direction, we can clearly see that Afro-Europeans, in fact, for that matter, Afro-Caribbeans, African people, will identify with the African-American struggle because, you know, they share this notion of that Black people have a common fate, right? Because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of colonization. So there is a need to support their brothers and sisters, you know, across border. And beyond brothers and sisters, support oppressed people generally speaking. On the other side also, there is a view that African Americans are sort of these modern soldiers of, you know, who fight, you know, who are the best at fighting anti-Black racism, right? Who in fact are not only fighting, you know, the best at fighting anti-Black racism, but who sort of shape the direction of modernity and shape what is cool, in fact, you know, to be cool about Blackness. And so you have those 2 different views of African Americans coming from Blacks throughout the diaspora. And sometimes, you know, it can be sort of, it can be full of ironies. I'm going to give this anecdote. This summer I was traveling in Martinique, in the French Caribbean, where I met this young man from Martinique who studies in France. He's a university student. We met on the beach. You know, there's this place where you can do, like, you know, street workouts on the beach. It's a wonderful place. So we were on the beach. He's topless doing his pull-ups, and I noticed on his chest a tattoo, and the tattoo says, first of all, it wasn't a good-looking tattoo, but it said "hustler," you know. And so, you know, hustler, a bad-looking tattoo that says hustler. And so I approached the young man and I said, "Young man, you know, do you actually know what you wrote, you know, on the, you know, do you know the meaning of hustler?" You know, because he thought this was a cool, you know, African-American hip hop thing. And, you know, do you know the French meaning? Do you know actually, when Martinique, do you know the Creole meaning of the term hustler? You know, do you know what it means? He did not know. And so I told him that it means débrouillard, you know, débrouillard, débrouillard, a hustler. And it's a term that, you know, that is not well seen. To be a débrouillard in Martinique is not a good thing. It means that you don't have a stable job, that, you know, that you're trying to sell stuff that you get in the street, you know, that, you know, maybe you sell fish if you find fish. Your mama doesn't want you to be a hustler, you know. And so he paused and realized, And so to me, that moment symbolizes sort of like the irony, the fact that these young men, in fact, who's students in France somewhere, has nothing to envy his African-American counterpart, yet he views them as, you know, sort of a source of inspiration. And I think I'm gonna end it there. Thank you very much, Gary, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Felix. Additionally, lots to reflect on as well. We have several questions already that have been submitted, and we have plenty of time for more. So if you have, for those in the audience, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. If you are a student, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask Gary your question directly. And we have Felix for a few more minutes before he needs to step out. So I will read some of the questions, and of course, Gary and Felix as well, feel free to offer your comments while you are still here. So our first question is the following. What role does class play in the disconnect or possible connection between Europe and the US?
Okay, I'll go first. I mean, I don't think there is any understanding of race without class, and no understanding of class without race. They're kind of, to try and understand either of them separately is to misunderstand them both completely. One of the things that is misunderstood, I think, in Europe is the degree to which there is more class diversity in America. That there are, people know that there are some very rich Americans, but what they can't, African Americans, but what is much more difficult to understand or to imagine is a place like Atlanta or Charlotte, where you have a significant kind of organic Black middle class, because we don't have that in Europe, not yet. We are generally speaking, my generation, I'm 52, our parents were bus drivers or train drivers or nurses. My mum was a nurse and then a teacher, but there were certain kind of jobs that people came to do. And so the British class system is such that there's only so far that you're kind of, you know, that you are really going to travel. So one of the things that does happen has been happening for, I would say, about the last 25 years or so, is a migration of Black people from Europe who make it through, the handful that do make it through, to the US, where they will find more opportunities in academia. A significant number of Black British academics certainly end up in America, in the movies. And that was true of my eldest brother came to America to run the Travel Channel. It was a kind of opportunity that he wouldn't get in Britain. And the way here's the way I would describe it from a personal point of view. I was raised by a single mom. There were three boys, my two brothers. Statistically, in America, one of us would be in prison or dead by the age of 30, given our socioeconomic status. In Britain, I had a hernia when I was 8. I went to the hospital, it was fixed. That wasn't, like, no money changed hands. My mother was an epileptic. She got her meds. We have a national health service. When I got my grades, I went to university. When my mum died when I was at university, I got more money to stay at university. class in Britain could get you that far. Class, the welfare state and so on. But then you get a certain place and then nobody's heard of you. And actually it's very, very difficult to progress. You are the only person in the room and so on and so forth. And at that point, people end up going to America quite often where they feel they have more opportunities. But they only have those opportunities once they've kind of penetrated those barriers.
Thank you. Felix, you want to comment as well? Oh, you're muted. Oh, Felix, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Class, just a brief talk about, class in France specifically. Likewise, as Gary mentioned, the African diaspora in France was, by and large, a working class diaspora. There's always been, of course, intellectuals moving around, professionals, but that was very few. And that working class sort of exploded in the 60s and 70s. And the question is, have their children been able to sort of go up the social ladder? It's hard to say for a fact in France, again, because they don't keep statistics. But I think generally speaking, the answer would be yes and no. But it's a very it's a very complex phenomenon. One can say for sure though is that the Black French people of Caribbean descent, Caribbean origin, actually sometimes, most of the times, fare better than their counterparts in the French Caribbean. All right, so one would have again to look at origin, race, not race. I mean origin, gender, class, nationality also plays a very important role.
Great, thank you both.
That means I have to leave.
Okay, thank you so much, Felix. I appreciate you joining us.
Yeah.
Our next question is from a master's student at Pitt, and is the following. In my travels to Europe, I've noticed a type of resentment because of an insistence to filter Blackness in Europe through an American read corporate media lens and allowing space for Black European life to serve as its own distinct identity, though connected. What have you found useful on the interpersonal level to make these types of exchanges more productive and not an opportunity to spark another battle within the diaspora war?
Can you repeat the first bit again?
Sure. Let's see. I've noticed a type of resentment because of an insistence to filter Blackness in Europe through an American lens and allowing space for European life to serve as its own distinct identity, though connected.
So, I mean, that's a good question because I've experienced that. I mean, I spent 12 years in America, and I'm British, and for better and for worse, Britain is particular in its kind of in the way that it relates to Europe, and so there's a range of things that. Range of ways of talking, of definitions even. So in Britain, we would use the term politically Black, which would, we had used the term politically Black, which encompassed all non-white people under the notion that Black is not an actual color, it's a political color, and that we shared enough of the same experience and so on and so forth. That didn't fly in Europe, for example. Just one example. And I really noticed it quite keenly last year. There was a little window when we could travel, and I went to Amsterdam and Utrecht in Holland to do some talks. And I realized kind of how, however absurd this was, how Anglo-Saxon I was, or Afro-Saxon, you might say, that I was, I was baked in a British mold. to some extent, and that and so a lot of my reference points and a lot of my thinking was askew. It wasn't wrong, it was just askew. And what the direct answer to the question would be, my experience was to talk less and listen more, and that kind of, and to not assume too much, and that a range of things that I might take for granted may not be true. One of which was actually the centrality of America to my thinking, which wasn't quite the same in the rest of Europe. And one of the ways that this came out, one was in my conversations about political blackness, which just kind of didn't land in a sense. But the other was in our conversations about the book Afropean by Johnny Petts, I think his name is, which I thought was a good book. And lots of them thought it was a good book, but then but one of their criticisms was it was too much about America, and it was this and it was that. And I thought, yeah, I mean, I was raised in the country that did Brexit. I didn't support Brexit, but I come from that country. We do have to cross the water to get here. The notion of popping over to Holland if you're in Belgium, or Belgium if you're in Holland, or to France, the notion of being kind of the continent wasn't something that I was kind of raised with. And that would affect my racial politics in terms of how I understand myself within this sphere. And that given that the sphere that I was in, English speaking, with a connection to America, was in many ways the dominant sphere, it was up to me to be quiet and listen, and to follow the conversation rather than try and lead it.
Thank you. So next we have a question from a colleague at the City University in New York. And he asks the following. You tell a story of the tremendous influence of African-American experience and political thought on the continent and its Black communities. Today's dominant approaches to addressing racial inequality in the US are critical race theory and the anti-racism of Ibram Kendi. Is Kendi's idea that the US should create by constitutional amendment a Department of Anti-Racism with the power to pass judgment on racist legislation imaginable in Europe?
No.
Would you, so would you support the creation of a Ministry of Anti-Racism in the UK?
You know what? If someone was calling for it, then I wouldn't oppose it. But it wouldn't be where I would invest my energy, because of the range of things that I want to happen that are never going to happen. That would be fairly low down. And just to kind of just to segue a little bit, but I do think it's relevant, which is when that thing I said about kind of being Black and British and going what we in Britain call on the continent, as though Britain is on some other continent, and realizing that we're exactly speaking the same language, both literally and metaphorically, that a lot of these things don't translate very well. And I thought it was whatever one thinks of this, the demand to defund the police in America, which is not a discussion that I want to have now. I thought that it did not translate when it came to Britain, and when certain Black Lives Matter activists called to defund the police, it kind of the work hadn't been done, the context wasn't there, and it's not that the themes that they were kind of arguing, kind of as I understand it, the themes that they were arguing about actually that conversation had happened. And we talk about public health approach to policing and so on and so forth. But some Black Lives Matter groupings kind of took the slogan, and I thought it doesn't translate. You know, it's different if you're in a city where Black people are a majority or the largest kind of minority, or just have a critical mass. But London is the biggest Black city in Britain, and we're about, I would say about 18-20% tops. So there's a real limit to, you know, what we're going to do. So going back to the question about Ibrahim Kendi, it's not, I mean, that may be a thing that a demand that people might rally around in America, and it doesn't bother me much if the thing one rallies around is going to happen or not. What matters is whether it assists in going forward or not. No one could imagine the world that Martin Luther King described in 1963. It doesn't matter. The fact is that they wanted to, and then they moved towards it. But that would be a kind of demand that I don't think would translate.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions on related to colonialism. I'll ask you both of them, and you can take them as you wish. So the first question that came in before the talk actually is asking if you consider the European Union to be a neo-colonial project. And while you think about that, a second different yet in some ways perhaps related question that was put in the Q&A is the following: if you think all nations you know, are both sort of complicit and duplicitous in their denials of colonialism, embracing whiteness as anti-Blackness, etc.
So I guess the answer to the first question would be no, not really. I don't consider it neo. I mean, I consider the European Union deeply problematic, and one of the awful. I voted to remain. Because I thought that we can't opt out of neoliberal globalization, and Europe offered some social democratic protections in terms of you know, things that one could lobby for and so on. And I like the free movement of people. But it's not an unproblematic institution, and it's deeply undemocratic. And the real kind of waste of that moment really was that if they had not gone on this xenophobic binge, but actually kind of there was another argument against the European Union that I think was much more powerful about the lack of democracy and so on. That even if we'd made the mistake of going out, it would have landed a kind of a blow, because lots of people have that view, and an awful lot of the rise of the far right in Europe isn't about immigration or Black people. It's about Europe and this notion for which there is some case that the ability to kind of guide your affairs are being kind of taken away by someone else. But I don't consider that neo-colonial, just one more kind of not particularly democratic supranational organization. I'm assuming for the second question, when you say all countries, you mean all Western or predominantly white countries, because in Africa and the Caribbean, they're very aware of colonialism, you know, you can't really miss it. To which I think that different places, and those figures that I mentioned from their YouGov survey show, different places forget in different ways and to different extents. With different effect. So in America, for example, I was always struck by the fact, I mean, America, I mean, it did have colonialism, but not the kind of we're talking about now, that because its segregation and slavery happened there, it was undeniable. So even George Bush after Katrina would say, you know, we have this history that we have to, you just kind of, even the really crazy right-wing people in America wouldn't say segregation was a really good thing and slavery was a really good thing. Whereas the Labour leader, Gordon Brown, said, you know, we have nothing to be ashamed of. Colonialism, we built roads, the empire was a good thing. And so the capacity for distortion is huge. And I do think that Britain suffers more than most because its empire was so huge. If we take, for example, a comparison with Portugal, which I don't know an awful lot about, but I do know that first of all, it lost its colonial possessions much later than other places, and it lost them in wars where significant numbers of Portuguese people died, and as a result of them losing them, actually democracy came to Portugal. That there is a different understanding of what colonialism was about than in Britain, where kind of people choose not to know. And to the extent to which they do know, it's the kind of, you know, it put the great in Great Britain. So there was this kind of this puffiness, this puffed upness, without any sense of what you're being puffed up about and why and how. And that comes with a kind of absolute denial of any collective responsibility. So people will say, we won the war, even if they didn't fight, even if they weren't born. They'll say we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play, even if they weren't born. But if you say you colonized people, they'll say that wasn't me, I wasn't there, I wasn't born. And so there is this kind of arm's length flee from its history.
All right, so we have several more questions, but unfortunately, I think we're only going to have time for one more. But thank you to everyone for being putting so many thoughtful questions to Gary. So I think the final question we have is from a graduate student at Pitt, and he asks the following: how much does the focus on the racism and structural challenges for African Americans in the U.S. obfuscate how African Europeans view their own situation? You mentioned how European politicians focus on the American experience to show how the continent's African population have it, quote, better. Do African Europeans agree with this or pay lip service in agreement to this to not rock the boat, so to speak, while privately saying, actually, we have our own problems that mirror what is happening in the US?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, when I think there is a sense of collective eye rolling when people say that, because we know it's different. Nobody's saying it's the same, but it comes back to the story I told about James Byrd and Stephen Lawrence. If the difference is, well, we don't decapitate people, we just stab them to death. Well, you know, that's not a difference that most people are interested in. I don't think that the challenge, and this came through in the Black Lives Matter protests, that time and time again across the continent, people would say, it would start with George Floyd, and then they would say, but do not for a second believe that this isn't a problem here. And that the kind of, you know, and it landed, I described it as a pollination. It landed on these different things, on statues in Britain and Belgium, on Zwarte Piet in Holland, on you know, it was on police brutality mostly in France, that it landed in these kind of in these different ways. And I mean, the exhausting thing was that it was kind of left to Black people to do the translation and to say no. And so the politicians were in flight, obviously. in Britain, including Labour politicians. This is not about us. This is about them. Of course, racism is terrible over there. And then we would say, yeah, but what about this and what about that? Well, but this is over there, and we don't want to. It's not the same thing. You're not being shot down in the street. To which people I know would say, do we have to wait until we're shot down in the street? And no, we're not being shot down in the street, but we are being murdered in detention, and you know, this has happened to us and that is happening to us. And if the bar is so high that you have to be shot down in the street before we can protest, then you know that's not going to work. So there was an attempt at an elision, but most black people that I know in Europe, particularly, and this would be particularly true since Trump actually, really didn't put an end to it, but it certainly punctured the notion of the great American kind of El Dorado. It's mostly greeted with a sense of exasperation. Once again, whoever it is, finding a way not to talk about what's going on here, wherever here is.
Well, I think that's a appropriate point to end on. Thank you so much, Gary, for this very insightful talk. Obviously, also thanks to Felix. He has left, but for his comments. Of course, we could continue this conversation for much longer, but I don't want to keep you beyond beyond the time that we agreed to. But thank you again for this, and thank you to our audience for joining us and for all of the very insightful questions that were asked, and apologies for not being able to get to all of them. A couple of points to note. There is a link for a survey that's been put in the chat. For those in the audience, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that and spending just a couple of minutes providing us with some feedback, we very much appreciate that and do use that in planning for future events. I'd also encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our Year of Recovering Europe programming, as well as other Jean Monnet in the US network programming as well. And those will all appear in the chat hopefully shortly. And hope you all have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are joining us from, and hope to see you at another event in the future.